Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dr. Lisa Napolitano. I'm the president and founder of Florida CBT, and I want to welcome you to this professional training webinar. Florida CBT is a multidisciplinary nonprofit organization, and we're dedicated to the dissemination of CBT as well as the promotion of community among CBT providers. And over the course of the year, we offer a variety of networking and educational events. So please check out our website for upcoming events at floridacbt.org. Today, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Nitsa Tonarelli-Busto and Jamie Sherman, who will be presenting on the Unified Protocol for Children and Adolescents. Dr. Tonarelli-Busto is a licensed clinical psychologist who serves as the clinical director of the CAMAT program at the University of Miami. She's also a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Psychology and a bilingual evaluator and clinical supervisor in the Autism Spectrum Assessment Clinic. She received her PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Miami and completed her clinical internship at the Mailman Center for Child Development at the University of Miami's Miller School of Medicine with a specialization in parent-child interaction therapy. She specializes in the evaluation and treatment of a range of difficulties, including anxiety, depression, obsessive-compulsive disorder, Tourette's, ASD, and disruptive behavior disorders. She's a certified therapist and a certified trainer in the Unified Protocols for the Transdiagnostic treatment of emotional disorders in children and adolescents, providing training and consultation in this treatment protocol. Dr. Sherman received her PhD in clinical psychology at the University of Miami. And during her time at Miami, she received specialized training in the treatment of anxiety, depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, autism spectrum disorders, and disruptive behavior disorders in children, adolescents, and young adults. Dr. Sherman completed her clinical internship and postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Miami's Miller School of Medicine within the pediatrics department. And during this time, she gained specialized training in parent-child interaction therapy. And she has been a certified level 1 trainer in PCIT since 2019. While at University of Miami, Dr. Sherman was an author on the Unified Protocols for Children and Adolescents. She is a certified trainer for the UPC and UPA and provides training and consultation in these treatments. So I'm going to turn it over to you guys. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for being here. So I think we have 4 attendees. So if you want us to be a little bit more interactive, we can be. Please, raise your hand or just like come off mute and ask questions as you go. You can always put them in the chat, but feel free to kind of interrupt us, and we can make this a little bit more conversational since we have more of a trying to think of the friendly word, the nice word for like a more quaint little group here. So like Lisa mentioned, Jamie and I are both certified trainers in this protocol. Today, it's really going to be just an intro to the treatment. We do both offer training in this, full training in this protocol. Usually the intro training is about 12 hours divided into 2 6-hour days. Certification in this protocol requires 16 hours of consultation to follow. So if anyone has questions about more intensive training, please reach out and we can chat about that. So we're going to try to move through this quickly. It's hard to get 12 hours of training into 2 hours. So we're really just going to highlight the important things here so you all have a sense of what this treatment has to offer. So just a couple of financial disclosures. So both Jamie and I, like I said, receive payments for UPC and UPA clinical training, consultation, and implementation support. So today we are going to go over the rationale for the UPC, the UPA. We're going to talk very briefly about key research on these protocols. very briefly on the caregiver components, and we'll talk through some clinical implementation of the UPC and the UPA. So I just want to start with some important statistics related to the prevalence of anxiety and depression. So a meta-analysis in JAMA from 2021 found that 20% of youth had clinical symptoms of anxiety, and 25% had symptoms of depression during COVID. In 2019, 13.6% of US kids between the ages of 5 and 17 had received mental health treatment in the past 12 months for any concern, with the vast majority having behavior problems. At best, 5% of those youth received counseling or therapy or getting help for an emotional disorder. And of those, most clinician-reported data would suggest that roughly 40 to 60% incorporate some level of EBT technique, with the primary technique utilized for anxiety or depression being considered less active elements. So we're talking like psychoeducation. So a significant proportion of youth are experiencing mood and anxiety concerns, and far fewer are receiving therapy for these concerns. So a couple other important points about youth anxiety and the related emotional problems. So the median age of onset for anxiety disorders occurs in early to middle childhood, right? In addition, anxiety, depression, related emotional disorders like OCD impair functioning in multiple domains. And when we're working with kids, right, we're thinking family, school, peers, a lot that they are experiencing at any given time. And youth emotional disorders also increase the risk for a trajectory of subsequent psychopathology and negative outcomes lasting into adulthood. All of us who work with kids know, right? Comorbidity is really the rule rather than the exception. So up to 75% of children with an emotional disorder diagnosis have a co-occurring disorder. So problems not only co-occur at this moment, right? But they also co-occur over time. For example, early separation leads to generalized anxiety, which leads later to depression. And this really isn't just an artifact of the DSM or ICD. We know that there are overlapping features across these emotional concerns. And finally, ongoing stressors and disparities have an effect for youth that is transdiagnostic, right? So meaning high family conflict or poor peer relationships don't just lead to anxiety or depression, but more typically a combination of emotional concerns. So the good news is that we have a lot of treatments that work, right? So given the huge international need for assistance related to youth emotional disorders, you'd think one of our main priorities as a society would be to train a workforce of clinicians to disseminate any of the many evidence-based psychotherapy manuals that have been developed over the last 50 years, most of which focus on a single emotional disorder or a narrow band domain of emotional disorders. However, right, we know that most organizations lack funds to train on any EBTs consistently. So picking one disorder specific or problem specific approach to spend those funds on, as good as the efficacy, right, or data may be for these manuals, fails to use the training time efficiently and may not be consistent with how most youth present or how most providers deliver these strategies to families. So when thinking about what the UPs treat, right, we're looking at anxiety disorders, depressive disorders, and related concerns. So OCD, and some trauma-related concerns as well. The other piece, right, in addition to the comorbidity that we see in youth, we know that techniques across different evidence-based treatment manuals don't differ that much, right? So most include a focus on emotion identification and affective labeling, right? Identifying the three-component model of emotions, understanding when one is experiencing an emotion and labeling it. Most include education about how emotions impact behavior through avoidance, escape, aggression, compulsions. Most include cognitive strategies, right? Like cognitive restructuring, mindful awareness, behavioral experiments. Opposite action strategies like behavioral activation, problem solving, exposure. And finally, many include caregiver strategies like psychoeducation, strategies for adjusting emotional caregiving behaviors that impact child emotional disorders. So, in response to the needs for a treatment that addresses these core processes underlying commonly co occurring emotional disorders and the extant similarity of effective techniques for these conditions, Dr. Ehrenreich Schmay at Boston University developed an intervention for youth that focuses on a singular, what we call core dysfunction in emotional disorders. So instead of focusing on circumscribed emotions and situations that fit within one diagnostic category, the UPC and UPA focus on the experience of strong emotions and youths and caregivers' relationships with them more broadly. So it does this as well using a modular treatment structure and emotion-focused content that allow for EBT techniques to be applied across problem areas. So let's talk theory. Okay, so the working theory underpinning the UPs is that neuroticism is this higher order core dysfunction that gives rise to mental disorders such as anxiety, depression, OCD. And it can be engaged in treatment across those with differing emotional disorders. So, from a conceptual point of view, neuroticism here refers to children who have heightened affectivity in response to stimuli or situations and have trouble tolerating the uncomfortable body sensations, cognitions when experiencing these strong emotions. And so, of course, right, if you're having a lot of strong affectivity, anxiety, depression, sadness, and feel that you can't cope with those, right? You're going to want that experience to be over as soon as possible. And so then these kids engage in behaviors like avoidance, escape, compulsions, suppressions that make those strong emotions go away in the short term. And so we know, right, avoiding emotions works in the right way, right? But it backfires, leading to more frequent and more intense emotions, starting the cycle of negative affectivity all over again, really maintaining neuroticism. And as parents, right, we may see our kids having these heightened reactions to emotions and have strong emotional reactions within ourselves, leading to other unhelpful behaviors like accommodation, criticism, and these may reinforce aspects of neuroticism as well. So, our research on youth with emotional disorders suggests that these aspects of neuroticism, in fact, do form a latent construct, and this latent construct predicts scores on parent and child rated anxiety, depression, and OCD, as well as independent evaluator rated global severity. So, one developmentally sensitive aspect of the UPCs and UPA is the completely concurrent caregiver modules. So, in UPC, caregivers have their own group where they learn to improve their own tolerance of emotional distress when engaging with a highly emotional child, and how this might play out in terms of emotional caregiving behaviors like accommodation, inconsistency, excessive negative social attention, and for parents with their own dysregulation, right? Modeling of emotional behaviors like avoidance or aggression, verbal or physical, and how these may reinforce kids' perceptions of threat as well as their own poor emotional self-efficacy over time. So in the UP, we teach parents what we call opposite actions to these emotional caregiving behaviors to support this goal.
Lisa, can I ask, how is neuroticism measured? What measures do you use? Is it the parents' observational and then report?
That's a great question. So we measure neuroticism through those three factors. So we assess avoidance, distress tolerance, and just RCADS or SDQ, more of an emotional measure,
Okay.
and change over that across time.
So I'm not a child person, so with adults, it's always self-report measures. So I guess the parents are filling these out?
Yeah, so parents and kids, we get both raters.
Okay, thanks.
Right? Yeah. For the kids above 8, we get their self-report. The kids under, we just get parent report. Great question. Okay, so just kind of some overarching logistics of the two treatment protocols. So the UPA is written as an individual therapy approach, and it's for adolescents 12 and over. Skills are presented in the general context of emotions rather than in the context of any particular disorder. The goal is for it to be time limited. So we, in our treatment studies, usually do 16 sessions of UPA. It can be done in as few as 8 sessions, and up to 24 sessions. It has 8 core modules plus a caregiver focus module. So again, like I said, it's written in the manual as an individual therapy approach. We have delivered it as group therapy as well, and so we can always, talk a little bit more about what that might look like. In the UPC, families typically meet weekly in a group format. So it's written as a group. In chapter 23 of the therapist guide explains how to deliver it individually. But in our group format, there are separate caregiver and child session time, with a heavy emphasis on activity-focused learning and positive reinforcement throughout. It uses an emotion detectives theme, where kids are learning how to solve the mystery of their emotions, and they earn badges for doing so. And we use the acronym the CLUES skills, which stands for the same modules that we cover in the adolescent protocol that then we cover in the UPC protocol. Consider how I feel, which is more of that psychoeducation. Look at my thoughts, which is identifying thinking traps, using detective thinking and problem solving, experiencing my emotions, which is mindfulness and exposures, and stay healthy and happy, which is our relapse prevention module. And so just so everyone is aware, you can download any fillable worksheet, which is anything in the workbook, for free at the Oxford University website. And so anyone can have access to those, and the books are available for purchase on Amazon. Okay, so moving into a very brief overview of UPC and UPA research. So to summarize it, right, our existent research suggests large effect sizes for the UPC and UPA in research clinics using our whole manual in terms of both youth and parent psychopathology symptoms. And there are a few predictors of lesser outcomes, suggesting that a transdiagnostic framework can be robust in its impact on youth. Recent findings on brief and stepped care versions of the youth UPs is also promising, particularly stepped care models delivered via telehealth, with heavy early emphasis on behavioral strategies and caregiver engagement. And with colleagues, we've adapted the UP for a number of other problem areas cross-culturally and for differing community settings, some of which are super interesting, like for sexual minority youth, non-Western cultures, and is summarized in a recent book on the topic. On the downside, our results in some community samples have been underwhelming thus far, suggesting a strong need for mixed methods approaches and personalized tailoring and training. And we also need to approach our work with greater cultural humility moving forward and acknowledge the need to sensitively address applications for BIPOC samples, as well as for youth with more severe emotional dysregulation. Okay, so key to the developmentally sensitive aspects of our approach are the caregiver-focused aspects of the protocol. So as mentioned, we think that we're mechanistically targeting caregiver emotional distress and emotional caregiving or parenting behaviors with these aspects of the protocol. Specifically, targeting behaviors such as accommodation, excessive negative social attention, caregiver modeling of distress, and inconsistent application of reinforcers and discipline behaviors in light of youth distress. And so a couple of concepts to keep in mind when discussing emotional caregiving behaviors. So the first is really emphasizing that these emotional caregiving behaviors are extremely common, right? These families, any family who dropped into a clinic would probably show one of these emotional caregiving behaviors. I know for me as a parent, I demonstrate these emotional caregiving behaviors, even though I know better, right? Because parenting is hard. And so you want to make sure that you are emphasizing that when talking with caregivers, right? That these arise out of well-intentioned efforts to reduce their child's distress. This is not them being bad parents. It's simply just, they're trying to make their child feel better and not recognizing that feeling this emotion is actually the better choice. Okay? So we also talk about how all caregivers can really benefit from learning more effective ways to manage their child's distress. We empathize with caregivers, right? How caregiving can be so overwhelming and that they're allowed to have their emotions too, but also helping them to recognize that those emotions drive certain behaviors that are more or less helpful. And then, of course, we are not expecting perfection in their application of any of the strategies that we're suggesting they take. All right. So, in terms of what we're covering, right, we're talking about accommodation and overprotection, and we're discussing the normative function of overprotection. We're explaining the need for labeled praises of good coping techniques. We're encouraging healthy independence granting through planned ignoring of minor inappropriate behaviors, and explaining how to use differential reinforcement of other behaviors that are more adaptive and, approach oriented. We're helping caregivers to recognize their own levels of criticism or negative social attention, right? When they tend to point out the things that their child might be doing wrong, or telling their child that this is no big deal, there's nothing to worry about, get over it, right? Things that are meant to kind of, from their perspective, convey that something is not scary, but might be perceived as invalidating or critical. And so we're encouraging them to express empathy and use positive reinforcement, teaching them how to label their child's emotions, convey understanding of those emotions, and encouraging their child to use skills and support that skill use. We're focusing on inconsistency and how to instead use appropriate rewards or reinforcers in a consistent manner, how to use behavior management techniques like appropriate house rules, effective commands. And finally, we're teaching how to engage in healthy emotion modeling, right? How to model appropriate labeling of emotion triggers, adopt non-judgmental stances to emotions, and identify and use appropriate skills or coping strategies for managing their emotions. And so we have a quick video here that demonstrates how we can do this with a parent.
Well, thank you for joining me here in session today, Ms. Vega.
Oh, of course. I'm happy to be here. I think things are going really well.
Yeah, Sophia's been a pleasure to work with. Last week we were going over some of the ideas about exposures and things that we could do in session. And I was really impressed that at home you guys seem to be talking about it and even coming up with some ideas for things that might help her at bedtime, like that mindfulness app. That was really creative.
I know. I'm happy to help. I mean, she's so motivated to stop worrying, and anything we can do to support her, we're going to do.
Yeah, well, we're going to talk about one other thing today that you guys could be doing to help her out a little bit more when she's feeling worried. And it's kind of ironic because it may involve actually helping her a little bit less when she's feeling nervous.
Oh, okay. So, we shouldn't have done that list. I mean, it seemed like it was working. She's not sleeping with my mother anymore, which is great. But
yeah, no, that was a really wonderful idea. I was actually thinking a little bit more about the times when she's calling from school and she's saying that she has a stomach ache or that she's having some difficulties with an assignment.
Yeah, that would be my mother again. She really, wants to go get her when that happens. Most of the time when she calls, I'm at work, and my mother just goes to get her.
Yeah, and of course, not laying blame on any one person. It's actually pretty normal and natural to respond to a child in distress and to, of course, try to make them feel better. If you think about it, it's like when they were babies and, they were, we get very conditioned to respond to different cries that our child has, whether it's because they're hungry or whether it's because they have a dirty diaper. And we get used to kind of, responding to those things as quickly as possible to try to help them feel better.
Right. And so what you're saying is that what we're doing now is sort of like swooping in to clean up her mess again.
You're right. It is a little bit like that. And I think that, as children age, we expect that they'll come to manage some of their own distress a little bit more and kind of need our help a little bit less and less. But the challenge is with anxious kiddos is that they may not as typically reduce the number of times that they're indicating distress to us, or that they need our help with something, whether that's because she's feeling nauseous or because she's having a difficulty with an assignment.
And then we, or maybe more precisely my mother, are coming in and, picking her up from school and cleaning up her messes again.
It does seem like sometimes that's happening. And what do you think that tells Sophia about what's going on in that situation?
I guess maybe that it is a really big problem, or maybe she can't handle it on her own.
Spot on, you've got it. It does suggest to her that there is a real threat, even when the threat isn't that big or it's actually manageable. And in some ways, it may also reinforce her for making the call in the first place because she gets out of school. And maybe she also gets a little bit of extra love in return.
Yeah, definitely a lot of extra love from my mother. Yeah.
And in a way, if you think about it, it also makes us feel better too. Because if we go back to that idea of when Sophia was a baby and, now she's not crying anymore, and, it feels nice to kind of have that distress stop for us too.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. So are you saying that we shouldn't come pick her up anymore when she calls?
That might be a good place to start, but why don't we think about it for a second and consider what we might say when she calls, or what your mom might say when she calls?
That's going to be hard because she's going to be really upset. I'm wondering if maybe we should just not answer when she calls from school.
Well, I'm not sure that that would be as helpful in the longer term. It's probably better that we come up with a couple of set ways to empathize with her if she's having some distress or if she's feeling unwell. But at the same time, are pretty clear that we won't be picking her up, or we won't be doing what we call accommodating her distress at that time.
Yeah, I think we definitely need to do that. I'm glad we're talking about this.
All right. So as you can see, right, she normalized what the parent is doing, provided some education around why she's doing that, right? It's not because she is bad or a bad parent or anything like that. It's because she wants her to feel better. So it's that well-intentioned effort, but giving some awareness, right, on how that actually is reinforcing the distress, right? And depending on the culture and where you're living and all of that, you may need to incorporate other caregiving figures, right, into these discussions, whether it be grandparents, aunts, uncles, nannies, etc. All right. Any questions about background, caregiving behaviors before I switch it off to Jamie? No? All right, Jamie, you want me to stop sharing? You share?
Sure.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to start getting us into the modules themselves, and just as a review, consistent with what Nisa said, all of the modules and like or generally the components of the UPC and the UPA are similar to each other. So, originally the UPA was a downward adaptation of the adult UP, and then the UPC was a downward adaptation of the UPA. So nothing is going to feel super different between the two. It's more just the way we present the material, the way we provide more visuals, more structure, more handouts, more parenting guidance when it comes to the younger kids. And the UPA, just as a reminder, was originally developed as an individual format. Okay, so UPA Module 1 does differentiate the UPA a little bit from the UPC, in that we do spend a little bit more time building and keeping motivation with our adolescents than we do with the younger children, which makes sense. I think adolescents are a tough group because a lot of times they feel like they can make their own treatment-related decisions, and instead others are making decisions for them a lot of the time. So sometimes adolescents want to come in, Other times adolescents are coming in because their parents want them to come in. And so we do need to sometimes spend a little bit more time on motivation. So in line with that, our module 1 goals are, first of all, to orient the adolescent and the family to the treatment concepts and the structure. We want to review the purpose of the UPA as being kind of a protocol that's meant to help adolescents to manage stronger, intense emotions in more helpful ways. We want to provide a general timeline for treatment. We want to talk about the role of home learning assignments, why we would do home practice during the week. And again, this idea of, we see your kid or you for 45 to 50 minutes a week, and you're spending the rest of your time on your own. And those are the times when a lot of times these triggers are coming up that we're going to want to use the skills to help you cope with. We want to set up expectations. We want to make sure people understand this isn't just a talk therapy. It's an active strategy-based treatment. If they had other treatment experiences or expectations, we might want to process that and kind of see what they found helpful about that, what they found less helpful about that. We do spend the majority of the session with the client alone when it's an adolescent. So we do then kind of excuse the parent. A lot of times we'll give them our defining the main problems sheet so that they can identify kind of their ideas of what the top problems might be. And then we obtain our 3 top problems from the adolescent. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We identify SMART goals related to the top problems. So SMART goals, specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, time-bound goals that they feel like that we actually feel like we can make steps towards. Now in the UPA, we sometimes use this little UP case formulation exercise, which I don't believe we're going to talk about too much today. No, but the idea of that exercise is that we are trying to figure out, okay, what are some top problems and some goals that feel UP specific? Meaning not just like I have anxiety, because one of the core pieces of the UP is this idea that emotions are normal, natural, and harmless. So really what we're trying to ground our top problems and our goals in is this idea that, okay, our emotions are okay, but sometimes due to the fact that those of us with emotional dysregulation experience emotions too intensely or too often, given the situations that we're in, maybe those strong emotion states are leading us into emotional behaviors like avoidance, aggression, worry, rumination, that might be actually causing longer term problems and not helping us cope with our emotions. We want to make sure we're creating these top problems and goals in line with those emotional behaviors so that we can really see how the UP tools and exposure are helping to manage those kinds of issues. We want to also spend some time clarifying the adolescent's desired parent involvement and maybe trying to convince them to increase that parent involvement a little bit, at least so that we could share with the parents, like, what are the skills we're learning so they can help reinforce that. And we also want to strengthen the adolescent's motivation for change. We want to identify initial steps that they might be willing to take. And we also want to kind of talk through, what are their experiences with strong emotions more generally? We want to try to do some general rapport building, make it conversational, and ask some kind of follow-up questions. If they mention worries or anxiety, ask questions about that. What do you do when it happens? Trying to get at some of those behavioral processes. We also want to try to encourage the adolescent to consider which strong emotions they're experiencing most intensely, and the behaviors that they are engaging in. And of course, we want to, once we identify those top problems, we want to rate them. So we want to figure out how much of a problem does the adolescent, how much of a problem does the parent think each of these things is. Like I said, we want to try to establish top problems around avoidance. Now, the tricky thing is that avoidance is not always behavioral or experiential. Sometimes we avoid intense emotion states by worrying, by researching, by ruminating, by engaging in compulsive behaviors. And so a lot of times it's not quite as simple as, oh, well, I avoid dogs because I'm afraid of dogs. But there's often a component of wanting to not have to tolerate that strong emotion and doing whatever I can to not have to tolerate that strong emotion. And in a sense, that is, of course, avoidance. If avoidance top problems are down, but the adolescent is still really struggling, we might have to use some other skills more intensely. So it's important to monitor these top problems throughout treatment, throughout each week of treatment, each session of treatment, so that we can get an idea of what's working and what's not working. So I mentioned that we want, the goal setting. I would say that the goal setting, you don't have to really break it down and be like, hey, is each one of these goals specific, measurable, like going into, but we're going to introduce this as like the overview. This is the kind of goal we're aiming for. But in reality, I don't spend too much time on the goals. We come up with these really specified, important, kind of well-defined top problems. And then a lot of times the goals are the reverse, right? If we're having, let's say I'm worrying a lot of the day. Okay. My goal might be to be engaging in other value-directed activities and less in my worrying behaviors. That's just like an example. But we want them to be measurable functional goals. We want to identify the goals. We want to make them more concrete if possible. And if time permits, like I said, come up with some smaller goals in order to reach the main goal. So making it more concrete, for example. So let's say, we want to break down the goal of, okay, I want to socialize more with people in school. Then I might think of a smaller step towards that, right? Like, well, what would that look like? Are you just going to go up and start a conversation with everybody you see? Probably not. Like, maybe I'll start with like making eye contact with more people in the hallway. Maybe I'll start with smiling as I walk down the hallway. That would be a smaller kind of goal towards that larger goal of socializing more with people. Any questions before we get to just a very brief? Some of you may have more extensive experience with motivational interviewing techniques. This is not comprehensive, but these are some of the main techniques that we might use during this module 1 to 2 session motivation building piece. Questions? Okay. So motivational enhancement techniques are reviewed in the protocol for sure, extensively in module 1. Sometimes a lot of times, we'll continue to incorporate some of these questions as we move on in treatment, as we encounter more challenging things that may serve to reduce motivation a little bit. But motivation can be especially important to build with adolescents. Like I mentioned, adolescents don't always seek treatment independently. Avoidant or withdrawn behaviors may decrease motivation for change. So depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms often do just decrease motivation on their own, and emotion-focused treatment concepts may be uncomfortable or distressing as well for some adolescents to discuss, which leads to like actual avoidance of talking about these things in session 2. So one goal here, motivation-wise, is more like an overall goal, is to express empathy. So of course, empathy is seen as the cornerstone of motivational interviewing and relates to any experiences conveyed by the client. So it's marked by an underlying attitude of acceptance in an effort to understand the client's feelings and perspectives without judging, criticizing, or blaming. Ambivalence is not viewed here as psychopathology. Instead, it's accepted as a normal part of the human experience and a normal part of a therapeutic process. And it's hard to let go of behaviors that have been serving a purpose for a client for so long in some capacity. And we want to show empathy for that fact as well. We also want to develop discrepancy between the client's present behaviors and their future goals. This is really important, I would say, especially when you're discussing things like breaking kind of these cycles of anxious behaviors and depressive behaviors and OCD behaviors that we're engaging in. So the adolescent's awareness of the consequences of their behavior is important. A discrepancy between present behaviors and future goals will therefore motivate change. By pointing out the discrepancy in a non-judgmental manner, you can lead the adolescent to present their own arguments for change, come up with them, quote unquote, on their own, and the discrepancy is explicitly developed as well in module 1 using an exercise we call the decisional balance exercise, which is basically just kind of writing out like reasons for wanting things to stay the same, reasons for engaging in change, and vice versa. We also want to avoid argumentation, just a general therapeutics tool, but also motivational interviewing tool. Arguments are easy to fall into, but can be counterproductive to change. When you defend your position, it breeds defensiveness and people generally become polarized. Especially in these early sessions, we see it as a success if the teen is even there, right? Engaging with you, rapport building. We want to say things like, I hear what you're saying, and that makes sense that you feel that way, you know? This may happen with disagreement about top problems. What you're saying is important, and I want to hear more about how you feel about that. So I'm going to make a note about that, things like that. We also want to roll with resistance. So the therapist invites the client to see a new perspective, but this perspective is not imposed. We present it as, I wonder, you know, if we could see it this way. And then if the adolescent is ambivalent about that new perspective, we don't push it further, because again, they become more polarized. And then we want to support self-efficacy. We want to empower the adolescent to invest in personal change. Belief in the possibility of change is very important as a motivator, especially in skills-based work, because it's hard work and they need to believe it's going to work. You can't just force someone, right, to do these things that are difficult for them. The client's responsible for choosing and carrying out personal change. So we want to highlight approach behaviors the teen is already engaging in, which can help build confidence. If they're feeling really down, we want to kind of put, you know, emphasis on just the fact that coming to see you is a choice they made, and a really good one. We want to take more of like a cheerleader approach rather than you need to do X, Y. And even in skills-based work, actually, most importantly in skills-based work, we have to stick to some of these concepts because there is this inherent tendency when we're teaching something to be very teachy. And so we want to try to stay away from that trap as well. So in terms of children and caregivers, so we don't outright skip motivational interviewing in the little ones, but we do really just kind of work on the top problems and spend less time with the more conversational piece given their age. So we do introduce here to session 1. Remember, this is designed as a group program initially. It can be definitely done in an individual way, but you'll see that it does refer to groups. So the child group goals are 1, to introduce children to the treatment model and the structure of the UPC, to identify top problems, just like we did with the adolescents that are behaviorally bound. And then develop rapport among group members and between therapists and group members, and introduce children to the purpose of emotions, begin to build emotional awareness. So specifically, we learn more about like what we're doing when we have an emotion, how the things we do when we're sad, angry, or scared can be helpful, how they can be not so helpful, to help the adolescent or the children understand this idea that emotions are normal, they're natural, they're harmless, they're there for a purpose. But sometimes when we respond in certain ways, our responses can be maladaptive. They can make us experience more strong emotions. And so we're presenting that in a child, in a child-friendly way here. Okay. We have a theme. Right, we have a theme because all child treatments have a theme. Our theme is emotion detectives. So we introduce emotion detectives as a special program that helps kids and their families learn about feelings like being happy, sad, joyful, angry, worried, and scared. We emphasize this fact that everyone has emotions, even tough ones, and that emotions are important, that sometimes strong or tough emotions can lead us to do things that can be less helpful and can also cause us to be really upset. We explain to the children that in this program, we work with you to learn new, more helpful ways to deal with some of these tough emotions that you might be having. Given that this is a group and it's young children, and even if you're doing this individually, it's a young child, we want to engage with a fun activity first. Sometimes we'll make silly name tags, do a magical power icebreaker. A lot of times if I'm in individual therapy, I'll have them like create and decorate like a folder for themselves, an emotion detectives cover sheet, things like that. We orient them to the workbook. We kind of point to them out how the child chapters happen first, then the caregiver chapters. We introduce Jack and Nina, which are our kind of primary 2 emotion detectives, and the program theme. We like to talk a little bit about, and kids often, do get, become interested in this component, this detective theme component. What do detectives do? We try to coach them to kind of, if they don't come forward with it right away, like, this idea that detectives solve mysteries, that detectives put clues together, collect clues to help them solve mysteries, and kind of transitioning them to this idea that we are going to be also solving the mystery of our strong emotions, hence emotion detectives. Okay. Then we also introduce helpful and less helpful emotional behaviors. And so you could see here, like, we do talk about helpful and less helpful emotional behaviors with the adolescents as well. That is part of our psychoeducation, regardless. But with the kids, we try to structure and provide some more visuals and some more examples so that they're not just lost in this sort of nuanced discussion. Instead, we're making it more concrete. So you could see here, it says just like this whole worksheet is about how to deal with strong emotions. Nina says, we all do different things when we're having an emotion. Work with your therapist to try to think of some helpful and less helpful things we can do when we have strong emotions, like being scared, worried, sad, or angry. We have given you an example to get you started. And so here you see the example is I'm feeling sad one day, so I go to the playground with my friends because I know I'll have more fun with them and feel better. And then less helpful is I'm feeling sad one day, so I stay home to take a nap. I wake up and feel even more sad and bored because I didn't do anything fun today. Given that this is a transdiagnostic protocol, they can really provide examples of any emotional state, and it doesn't have to be even labeled as an emotional, as a specific emotion that they have to aim towards. However, I often find that with my younger kids, it's much easier if I write next to each column, like angry, nervous, worried, not worried, anxious, so that they kind of get the vibe here, because sometimes it's a little bit unclear. But I think this is a great structured way to do this. And then also we might kind of play a couple games like we have in our manual, the true and false alarm game, the emotion thermometer game, where they're trying to get to know different levels of emotion with the emotion thermometer game. And then they're trying to identify things that might make them feel upset when they're not truly situations that should elicit that level of upset using the true and false alarm. Questions before I get into module 2, which is our psychoeducation. So the module 2 goals, module 2 in UPA maps on to the end of session 1 into session 2 in UPC. Our first goal is to begin learning emotion identification skills. Our second goal is to provide education about emotions, their functions, and their impacts on behavior. Goal 3 is to introduce the 3 parts of an emotional experience, which most CBT protocols do. I would say that the way that we break down emotions in the UP is slightly different, and I'll highlight that. Discussing reinforcement and the maintenance of learned behavior. And goal 5 is to teach the adolescent to break down their own emotional experience, determining the before, during, and after of the identified experience, which turns into our emotion tracking. I really don't use this worksheet very often. I say this every single time I do this. Some people use it, some don't. I like to kind of do this in more of a discussion based way. We also have a handout that has, it's called Emotions I Have, and it just has all the different emotion words. And a lot of times I'll just have adolescents pick out their 3 top emotions and just talk about what does it feel to have that emotion? What does it make you want to do? How does it feel in your body? What are you thinking when you have that emotion? So we want to let the adolescents know that emotions are important, right? They tell us what's going on, how we might respond. We want to let them know that emotions are normal, meaning everybody has them. They're natural, meaning we as humans evolved to have emotions. We wouldn't survive without emotions. I often like to give a couple of examples about how we wouldn't survive if we didn't have emotions. If I'm crossing the street and a car's coming, do I stay there or do I jump out of the way, right? Without that quick fear response, I would not be able to save myself. They're harmless, meaning even though emotions feel uncomfortable, they are not going to physically harm us. We like to explain that emotions are uncomfortable for a reason, because they're actually important and informative, and they're motivating us to do something. That thing that we do, we want to label, that's our first thing we label as an emotional behavior or an emotionally driven behavior. And we want to emphasize the fact that these behaviors are hard to resist because they're meant to motivate helpful action. Anger is another one that I like to kind of use as another example. If we think to back when we were cavemen, And our families are hunting and gathering food. Let's say we gathered all this food for our family and a bear comes and tries to take all our food away. Like, without anger and this drive to protect the people we love and the things that we care about, we wouldn't be able to jump into action, right, and protect our family and our food. Okay. So I talked a little bit about the true alarm, false alarm game already, but the idea here is to talk a little bit about triggers. And to first introduce triggers, we want to identify a trigger as the thing that made us feel the emotion. So we might ask ourselves, I was scared, happy, sad, surprised, angry because, and then whatever comes after the because is probably part of the trigger. Importantly, triggers can be internal or external. Triggers can be situations, they can be intrusive thoughts, or just random thoughts. They could be feelings in my body, my heart's beating fast and I don't know why, and that elicits an emotional response. One analogy we sometimes can use to introduce this activity is to think of the true and false alarm as like a car alarm or a smoke alarm going off erroneously. So, car alarms, for example, are there to help us, but they can malfunction. So just like we talked about with our emotions, they're important, they're natural, they tell us when something's wrong. But just like a car alarm can malfunction, our emotions may trick us to believe that something is very wrong when we're actually okay. So we can give an example like, Jack was playing tag during recess and he falls. He doesn't really hurt himself, but he gets a grass stain on his shirt and skins his knee. He gets really upset and angry at himself and cannot calm down. He goes to the nurse and asks to go home. So true alarms are important, right? Jack may not have been experiencing a true alarm, but true alarms are important when they are true alarms. They happen when something is truly wrong and they prepare us to get safety, rest up, and defend ourselves. So a lot of times with this true and false alarm game, we'll present some different scenarios like the one that I just gave you about Jack. We give them a bunch of different scenarios and we just try to encourage them to identify whether it's a true alarm situation or a false alarm situation. If Jack or Nina just feel like the situation's very bad or dangerous, even though things are probably going to be okay, it's a false alarm. So question for you guys, if anyone has anything they want to volunteer to share in the chat or out loud. Any idea why we might discuss true and false alarms, and or what do we think might happen if a child has experienced many true alarms in the past to their alarm system? I'll give you a second, but if no one has anything, I'll chime in.
Yeah, Chriselle.
It makes sense to me in order to normalize emotions when they're serving their function to the situation and differentiating when there's something adding intensity or occurrence of the emotions.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. We want to help them to differentiate and help them to understand that just because my body and my mind is telling me, like, I can rationally make this decision, though. Like, I can separate my rational mind, out from my emotional piece here. In terms of the too many true alarms in the past, what we find is that when kids have had too many true alarms, meaning like, they've gone through a lot of traumatic experiences, etc., it can actually cause their alarm system to be off kilter or hypersensitive. And so what we might see is more false alarm, like more difficulty differentiating true from false alarms in their lives, right? Because their body has been kind of conditioned to respond to things as if they are threatening for understandable reasons. So breaking down a strong emotion into its parts, this probably looks familiar for anyone here who has done CBT. The idea here is to break down our emotions as a way to slow down and untangle our sort of strong emotional experiences, which we sometimes refer to in the UPA as emotion twisters or tornadoes. Helps us to understand ourselves so that we can choose different behaviors. And really here we're planting the seeds. Trying to increase awareness, trying to help people to understand like what is contributing to these emotional experiences in terms of my thoughts, my feelings, my responses to my feelings, my behaviors, so that later in the protocol we can approach and use coping skills to manage these different components. So because you were thinking that everyone was staring at you and your cheeks were burning hot, you tried to feel better by waiting in the bathroom until the hallways were less crowded, right? We look out for more subtle emotional behaviors too, like distraction, neutralizing, suppressing, safety behaviors like keeping our head down, wearing baggy clothes, always keeping our phone in our hands. And we like to try to walk through at least 2 examples of different types of triggers or emotions here. Because it is transdiagnostic, we want them to understand how this skill applies to different emotion states. And we want them to understand that emotional behaviors like avoidance or aggression are common for learning for like as maladaptive strategies for coping with emotion twisters. So you could see here we have the trigger, we have emotions experienced, and then we have feelings in my body, what I do and what I think. They all impact each other, hence the bidirectional arrows. But one thing to note is a lot of times feelings in the CBT triangle refers to like an emotion. And here we're referring to sensations in the body. So heart beating fast, sweatiness, tight muscles, things like that. And the emotion part is up here because we see these 3 components as being what makes up the holistic emotion experience. That makes sense. Okay. And goal 4 is where you're really putting it all together for them. So the idea here is that if we, why do we keep doing emotional behaviors over and over? Well, they provide relief, right? They make us feel good in the moment. Avoiding anxiety provoking situations relieve our emotional distress in the short term. Letting out our emotions in an angry or frustrating, interpersonal confrontation might make us feel heard or better in the moment. But in the long run, right, what are we seeing? We're seeing that we can't avoid our triggers forever. We might miss out on things that we might enjoy or be able to handle if we're avoiding things. Emotional behaviors could get you in trouble, damage your relationships with others. We never get to see what might have happened if we didn't do the emotional behavior. How do we know we couldn't handle it if we didn't try to handle it? How do we know we couldn't tolerate it? We don't get to practice more helpful actions that will help us cope in the long run if we engage in these avoidant behaviors. And the more we avoid feeling our emotions, the harder or stronger they get. So because these behaviors do help us to feel less distressed, they are powerful. They teach our brain to keep doing the same thing. And we call this sort of cycle, we get stuck in the cycle of avoidance or the cycle of aggression, depending on if we're engaging in more of those approach aggression behaviors or the avoidance behaviors. After feeling stuck in these twisters and unhelpful cycles for a while, it can feel helpless, right? It could feel like there's nothing else we could possibly do. And so our goal here, of course, starting in the next component of treatment is to break that cycle. Like the idea is that we can change that. We can engage in certain coping strategies in order to get ourselves out of these cycles. Okay. Questions? Okay. So do we think we have time for this video?
I think we should probably skip it,
Yeah, let's skip it.
right?
I agree.
You can switch over to
Sophia,
Okay, so Nisa, I'll turn it over to you for module 3.
yes.
Actually,
gonna stop
I actually had a comment, if you don't mind, or just like
Please.
almost like a question.
Jamie, stop sharing while you.
Yeah.
Just the use of the word trigger. So this is a big thing as a DBT therapist. We refer to prompting events deliberately because we want people to acknowledge how the interpretation influences the impact of these things. I know you're working with kids, and cognitive change occurs just by virtue of changing your behavior, but do you address cognitive reappraisal at all?
Yes.
Okay.
That's basically cognitive reappraisal, thinking traps, cognitive reappraisal, and problem solving are all make up module 5.
Okay, great. Thanks.
All right. Okay, so jumping into module 3, this is the module where we start to introduce emotion-focused behavioral experiments and the concept of acting opposite. Given time, I may kind of go through this a little bit more quickly and highlight the important parts. So we have 4 goals here, but overall, the goals are to introduce the concept of opposite action, identify activities the adolescent enjoys that they can start to engage in for the purposes of behavioral activation, introduce the idea of tracking emotions and activity level, and setting the stage for ongoing behavioral experiments. Okay, so when we say opposite action, what we're talking about is acting opposite of an emotion's predominant action-related urge. Okay, so in this chapter, what we explain is that the clients are going to be beginning to practice using opposite action by doing what we call emotion-focused behavioral experiments, right? The idea being change one thing and see what happens to the rest of the emotional experience. So here are some examples of the way clients may act counter to their emotional behaviors. So for example, for clients who maybe do a lot of calling or reassurance seeking, right, we can limit the amount of calls, we can delay before we make the call. Perfectionistic behavior, right? They can leave things a little bit untidy or make a mistake on purpose. For checking behaviors, we may resist checking entirely, delay checking, mess with the checking. For avoidance and escape, we may stay in the moment for a little bit longer. For withdrawal, isolation, we may engage more, right? For very depressed teens, you might need to start really slowly, right? Say a client spends all of Saturday and Sunday in their bed, in their room. You might ask them to spend some time on the living room couch instead, right? We're not asking them to go out and run a marathon or go out and go to a party with friends because that might not be something that's feasible at the moment. Okay, so what you want to always ask yourself is what is the function of the emotional behavior as the client? And the answer is going to be, right, that the function of the emotional behavior is to get away from an uncomfortable emotion. So then the opposite action is whatever will make sure that that client seeks out and stays in contact with that uncomfortable emotion. So a lot of this module and the accompanying worksheets are focused on behavioral activation, okay? But this is really meant to be personalized and to be an introduction to exposures. So you can think of opposite action as mini exposures. So if if behavioral activation isn't really relevant, the client isn't depressed, they're not bored, they're generally engaging in things, you're going to focus on identifying behavioral experiments related to their top problems and emotional behaviors. And then using an emphasis of using opposite actions to break that cycle of avoidance that Jamie just talked about. So here, right, instead of identifying enjoyable activities, you may take the time to really delve into the behaviors and how they may alter them slightly to test out how that might make them feel. So for OCD rituals, for example, you may mess with that ritual. For participating in class, right, if they avoid that, maybe it's just looking up at the teacher or raising their hand in one of their easier classes, or just using their voice to say hi to the teacher when they enter the classroom. You might also add, right, like the clients are doing hard work in therapy, and even though their mood is usually good, you can also use opposite actions to boost their mood, to do self-care or help build energy and motivation. So for UPC, they're doing the same, right? They're learning about the concept of acting opposite, using science experiment language more in depth. They're learning about the connection between activity and emotion and learning how to track those experiences. So with the science experiment language, right, most kids this age have learned about science experiment steps. And so what you're emphasizing, right, is that every science experiment starts with a question. And so you can have the kids come up with some questions they might have. So for example, what else can I do after school when I feel sad? The second step in a science experiment, right, is to make a guess, make a hypothesis of what could happen, right? So maybe they could try kicking a ball outside, right? Try out the experiment. Maybe I'll do that for 10 minutes. and then see how you feel, right? So the idea is perhaps the client really doesn't feel like going out and kicking the ball. They feel really tired. They've had a long day at school and they just want to lay in their bed, right? But you're going to have them try something different. Try it out. Go kick that ball outside and then track how you feel and see if your mood lifts or not. And we can do the same thing with fear, right? So what do you think is going to happen if you raise your hand in that class? Oh, people might laugh at me. Okay, why don't we see if that happens? Let's treat that guess as a hypothesis rather than as fact and have them try it out. And what's really important here is that we should be having clients doing some kind of opposite action or behavioral experiment no later than session 4. Particularly if they have OCD, we just had research come out from our group that the UPC and the UPA are as effective for OCD as they are for anxiety and depression, but there is a slower rate of change in OCD symptoms in the first half of treatment, and then that catches up in the second half. But it really talks about, really kind of sheds light on the fact that we need to be doing ERP as early as possible with our OCD clients and with social anxiety as well, which we didn't have time to get into the research, but is one of the predictors of worse response to the UPC and UPA is social anxiety, and likely because they need more exposure instead of waiting until module 7 to get to it. So we start exposures definitely outside of session, no later than session 4, and you can even incorporate them in session while teaching other skills. Okay, I'm going to skip that. Okay. Moving into module 4. So far we've talked about skills to build emotion awareness and also about skills to recognize the relationship between emotions and behavior. And now in module 4, we're going to talk about the link between emotions and physical sensations and how we can help kids build more awareness of those physical sensations as to better cope with those sensations and the related emotions and behaviors. So the overarching goals of this module are to describe the concept of body sensations and their relationship to intense emotions. We're going to want to work with the adolescent to identify the feelings they have during emotional experiences using a body drawing and body scanning exercises. And then we're going to conduct a sensational exposures with the clients to promote awareness and tolerance of those body feelings. And so thinking back to modules 1 and 2, we can return to the breaking down my emotions form and focus on the feelings in my body part of the emotional experience. So we can call these physical or physiological sensations, physical feelings, or body clues, which is how it's referred to in the workbook. And so as we introduce this module to the client, we can highlight that becoming more aware of these body clues can help us to gain insight into our emotional experience as a whole and can potentially help us to better navigate situations in which we're experiencing strong emotions. And so we can talk here about the fight or flight system, right? So the fight or flight concept, right? That when we feel afraid, our body goes into fight or flight and prepares us to either flee or to fight, right? And so to do that, our body has physiological changes. And the problem is that that is happening in response to these false alarms, right? And because that's happening, our body is kind of tricked into thinking that we have to do something about it. Right? And so the more that we're aware of those physical feelings, we can kind of catch them like a clue that we might be experiencing a strong emotion, which can prompt us to reassess whether or not we're in true danger or we can sit through that experience. And so once we introduce the function of physical sensations and how they're generally related to emotions, we want to prompt the client to identify the physical sensations that are most relevant for them and their presenting symptoms. So everyone experiences these physical sensations differently, and even two kids who both have the same symptoms or diagnoses may experience very different physical sensations associated with those symptoms. And so one activity that we use to identify the body clues that might be most relevant for the client is to do a body drawing activity. So in the adolescent workbook, there's a figure very similar to this one. For the kids, there's also a figure like this, but often in the group, we'll lay them down on like large butcher paper and outline them. So it's a little bit more engaging. They can color it, they can paint it, they can write what body clues they're experiencing. But the idea is to map out on paper where in the body those physical sensations come up for the client. And you can use the body drawing to identify more generalized triggers, right? So where in your body do you feel anxious, right? Where in your body do you feel angry? And what are those feelings, right? For some adolescents and kids, it could be beneficial to give more specific examples, right? So when you walk into your classroom and you notice people looking at you, where do you feel that in your body, right? So some can benefit from more specific prompts like that. They can color code it, they can draw it. So clients like to draw like little butterflies in their belly for butterflies, different ways that you can make this fun and engaging for the clients that you're working with. And so after identifying body clues, you'll introduce the strategy for sitting with these physical sensations without trying to avoid them or change them. And so body scanning is one skill that can help us to become more aware of physical sensations, scanning our body to check for any clues that we may be experiencing a strong emotion, rating the intensity of those physical sensations, and then just observing those sensations over time and seeing how they change on their own without us having to do anything intentionally to change them. So we're observing these sensations non-judgmentally, meaning that we're not assigning a label or an interpretation to them, right? Instead of my stomach feels weird, right? We can say my stomach feels tight, it feels full, okay? We're just allowing ourselves to experience those physical sensations and anchoring ourselves in the present moment if we get distracted. And these themes of present moment awareness and non-judgmental awareness are things that we'll come back to later in the UP as well, but we have an introduction to them in this module. So again, right, physical sensations here might be a more or less prominent part of a given child's symptom presentation. So, for example, youth with panic disorder likely experience physical sensations as a more central part of their symptom presentation than youth with some other presenting concerns. But we want to conduct interoceptive or sensational exposures regardless of symptom presentation, right? The goal here is to create a situation which the client is able to experience, right, the physical sensations directly while not engaging in any avoidant behavior in response. So it's a new type of behavioral experiment. And really the goal is to reinforce the idea that physiological sensations are normal and natural and will come and go if we allow them to, right? So we will do a few sensational exposures in session. We typically aim for about 2 to 3. In the therapist guide, there's a list of different types of sensational exposures that clients can engage in to elicit various physical symptoms. So it really depends. You want to try to mimic the ones that they typically experience, right? If heart racing is one of their typical body clues, you can do one of those interoceptive exposures, right? Running in place, doing jumping jacks. If shortness of breath is one, right? There's hyperventilation exercises, dizziness exercises. So you really want to do one that kind of mimics what they're typically experiencing. And then you're going to do that sensational exposure, and then you're going to follow it up with a body scan, right? Where in your body do you notice that physical feeling? I also like to ask them what that makes them want to do, just to really highlight what the emotion urge is, and then encourage them to just sit with and tolerate those feelings as they come and go. And then you'll rate that over time. Right. Any questions about modules 3 or 4? No. Okay. So entering module 5, this is our flexible thinking module, usually about 2 to 3 sessions, could be more, could be less, really depends on the client. So here again, we have 4 goals. The first 2 are related to our cognitive distortion. So increasing clients' understanding and awareness of the way that their thinking impacts behavior, right? We're introducing the concept of automatic and alternative appraisals, right? The idea that we sort through a substantial amount of information on a daily basis, and that our kind of automatic thoughts help us move through that more easily, and how that can be a really helpful skill, but that sometimes that can get us into trouble, particularly when we fall into these what we call thinking traps in the UP. So we'll teach the adolescent about the common thinking traps, and we'll have them identify the thinking traps they typically fall into. Then we'll introduce and practice our cognitive restructuring skill, which we call detective thinking. And we will introduce and practice problem solving as well, which is really a flexible decision-making strategy. So what we're going to highlight here when we talk about automatic interpretations is that every day we sort through huge amounts of information. Right? And in order to do that, we develop automatic interpretations of things, places, and situations in our lives to help us sort through this information faster. And we're going to highlight, right, that generally this is a good thing. However, we may get caught up in cycles or patterns of automatically interpreting things in ways that lead to more frequent or intense emotional behaviors. And this is also because situations and things around can be pretty vague, right? So in order to reinforce this idea, we show the adolescent at least 2 optical illusions like this one. So we'll show them this optical illusion, and I'll say, well, what's the first thing that you see? Anyone want to shout it out, what they saw first? Oh, something in the chat.
Yeah, mouse.
Mouse, okay. Right. And so maybe someone else saw something else, but if I'm working individually, I'll say like, okay, go ahead.
I'd say a cat, maybe.
Right. Maybe you say a cat, right? But I would say, right, to that client, okay, so you saw a mouse. Do you see anything else in the optical illusion, right? Some clients are like, yeah, a cat, right? They say it relatively easily. Others get kind of stuck, right? Maybe we have to turn their head. Maybe I have to be like, okay, what if these are ears? Do you see anything now? Like I've had some clients really struggle with this. But then what you're going to highlight, right, is that automatic, that first thing you saw, right, happened with very little struggle, right? It happened almost automatically. The second thing the client saw took a little bit more effort, but that didn't make it any less true, right? So 2 things can be true. One might come more automatically, does not make it more true. And the same thing is true for our thoughts as well, right? So what you focus on, right, matters. And what you focus on impacts your interpretation. Your first impression, right, your automatic thought is likely the one that took the least amount of mental effort, just like that first thing you saw in the optical illusion, right? And that kind of tricks your mind into thinking that that must be what's true, right? That must be the one thing that's most accurate, right? But what we've just kind of highlighted is that that's not always the case. And that's particularly true when we're feeling a strong emotion, right? Because when we're feeling a strong emotion, we're much more likely to interpret things in a way that isn't always helpful, right? And so the idea of flexible thinking, which is what we're focusing on, suggests that more than one thing could be true when we interpret triggers or other antecedents of strong emotions, right? And so you can explain this using kind of an example of a vague situation, right? Like I often say, if I'm walking down the hall and I see 2 kids laughing, right? What might I think? Right? And so sometimes a client will say, well, that they're laughing at you, right? And if I think that they're laughing at me, how do I feel? And what does it make me want to do? right? But what else could be true here? Well, maybe one of them made a joke, right? And if that's the thought I was holding on to, how would that make me feel? Right? So the situation is exactly the same. How we interpret it is what is different. And both of those things could be true. Who knows, right? And so the difference, and we'll talk about this when we get to detective thinking, our goal is not to replace thoughts, right? Our goal is to simply allow for more than one thing to be true, to be flexible in our thinking. And so the next thing we do is we talk about thinking traps, which are cognitive distortions, right? A thinking trap is a characteristic way of interpreting the world. And it's called a thinking trap because often we get stuck in them, particularly when we're feeling anxious, sad, angry, or frustrated. And so what we want to do, right, is help clients to identify that, thinking traps are unhelpful when they get you stuck and when they lead to behavior that is more avoidant or aggressive in nature. Right. And so we talk about a few common thinking traps in the UP. There are many that we list, but two of the most common that we talk about are jumping to conclusions, which is the tendency to overestimate the amount of danger or threat in a given situation, and thinking the worst, which is the tendency to think that the worst possible outcome is going to happen. And so in order to think more flexibly, we provide a list of challenging questions to help inspire more and different possible interpretations of the situation. So we use these detective questions to help clients recognize alternative interpretations when they get stuck in thinking traps and to think more flexibly. So again, this probably doesn't look too different from the cognitive restructuring you've seen before if you've done CBT. But there are ways in which we use detective thinking that is specific to the UPC and A. So for starters, right, like I mentioned, we emphasize flexibility rather than changing cognitions altogether. And also, we don't refer to automatic thoughts as maladaptive negative thinking, right? Because we try to remain non-judgmental about thoughts. And also related to mindfulness, again, we ask clients to notice discrepancies between their reaction to situations and what's actually happening in the present. So this could include ruminating about the past, worrying about the future, or we may point out how automatic thoughts are making it hard to respond to the demands of the present moment. Okay. So as we go through treatment, we remind clients to catch those thinking traps and then use these detective questions. Am I 100% sure this is going to happen? How bad would it be if it did? What's happened in the past, right? To gather evidence to find alternative possibilities. And then finally, recognizing that that you're falling into a thinking trap is the first step to detective thinking, which is our cognitive restructuring. And so the next goal within the UPA is to increase cognitive flexibility and the ability to think logically in order to come up with other interpretations. And so it takes practice. So with detective thinking, we'll have them practice using this skill in session and out of session to reinforce it. And for the UPC, we're doing the same thing, but again, we're making it a little bit more fun. So in the UPC, we talk about snap judgments instead of automatic interpretations, and we give a lot of examples and worksheets for clients to start to practice, catching what the snap judgment was and identifying other more flexible thoughts. So we talk about thinking trap characters, and we gave the characters names, and this is one of the things that clients typically remember from UPC. So psychic Suki is our mind reading thinking trap, the idea that you can read someone's mind or know what someone is thinking. So many kids, right, have examples like, thinking that someone doesn't like them or someone doesn't want to be their friend, right, when there is no evidence to suggest it. Jumping jack is our jumping to conclusions thinking trap. Disaster Daryl is thinking the worst, which we talked about. And then negative Nina is ignoring the positive. So the tendency to focus on all the bad things you do or all the things you got wrong or how you could have done better rather than identifying anything positive that you did. So we have clients identify their own examples of these thinking trap characters. And then once the idea, we have a mystery game that we have them engage in to introduce detective thinking with the goal of using evidence to find out the answer to a question or to a mystery. And then we apply that concept to introduction of our detective thinking steps, which we call the stop, slow, go steps in the UPC. So we have clients go through this worksheet for various non-personal examples, and then we have them identify their own thinking traps and challenge those thinking traps using these steps. But it's the same idea as the adolescent cognitive restructuring detective thinking practice, but just with a little bit more direction just to support the needs of the younger kids. But the goal right here in STOP is to identify the situation, identify the thought, and take a guess on how likely it is to happen before you've done any detective thinking. Then you slow down and you gather clues. We have clients ask themselves what the thinking trap is, what's happened before, whether they're 100% sure, what else could be true, and then go to check their best guess. How likely is it now that we've gone through those that evidence gathering? How likely is it that that thinking trap is true? And then to come up with their more helpful, more flexible coping thought before they enter a situation. And then in addition to reinforcing cognitive flexibility and reappraisal in the UPA, we also focus on flexible decision-making via problem solving. So we teach clients both in UPA and UPC the steps for problem solving, identifying the problem, brainstorming possible solutions, importantly, without judgment, right? So in brainstorming phase, we actually will demonstrate coming up with kind of a out-of-the-box solution and make sure that clients are not judging that solution, because in the brainstorming phase, we don't judge. Then you come up with the pros and cons of each, and then you choose one and try it. And we start with kind of a fun example, like, moving a toy from one, or moving a book or a binder or a toy from one place in the office to another place without using your hands. So we start with kind of a fun, silly example, have clients identify possible solutions, and then have them try it. And then we apply problem solving, particularly to interpersonal conflicts, right? How do you solve conflicts or other kind of change other kinds of situations using problem solving strategies? Okay. Any questions about any of that? Yeah, Chriselle.
Just a question, if we're treating OCD with the cognitive restructuring, is there like something we take into account or change? Like I'm thinking if
Yeah,
they
that's a
use
good question.
it to use more, like, I don't know, evidence and get stuck in.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And thank you for bringing that up. So there's also an applications book that Dr. Anne Reich May wrote, and along a couple of other people wrote chapters within it that talks about how to tailor and modify the treatment for different presentations. For OCD in general, we add in some OCD specific psychoeducation in module 2. And we start ERP early when we, introduce module 3. Often I don't fully go into the cognitive restructuring work, particularly around the OCD thoughts, and focus more on mindfulness and behavioral experiments. But we can talk about putting thoughts on trial and things like that. But I don't do as much of the full-on detective thinking work with intrusive thoughts in particular. I don't know, Jamie, you have different thoughts.
Yeah, no, same. And I think there, to a certain extent, just this idea of externalizing OCD and identifying something as an OCD thought is, in a sense, it's not delving into what's the meaning of the thought, but it is a sort of like cognitive restructuring in a way, talking back to OCD, you know, that kind of
Right.
stuff. That's the cognitive component that we would probably emphasize a little bit more in OCD, but so I'm about to get into mindfulness, which is something that we might use a little bit more when it comes to OCD. And it's also the main skill that I would say that we use the most often during an actual exposure and immediately following an exposure versus like trying to use any of the more cognitive techniques during that time when emotion, states are more intense. Okay, so perfect timing. So moving on to module 6, which is awareness of emotional experiences. This generally lasts approximately 1 to 2 sessions, but as with all the other skills we've talked about so far, these things continue to get reviewed and discussed and checked in on and incorporated as we get into exposure 2. Okay, so goal 1 here is to introduce the rationale for present moment awareness and to practice present moment awareness activities in session. Goal 2 is to introduce the rationale for non-judgmental awareness, which is a subtype of present moment awareness, and practice non-judgmental awareness activities in session. And goal 3 is to introduce generalized emotion exposures and practice non-judgmental and present moment awareness in context, identifying and processing any subtle avoidance behaviors observed with the client. So here you have kind of the way that we introduce, and it's the same concept in UPC and UPA, but this is like a little, handout that we use with UPC, which is kind of a tracker for the my 5 senses game, which allows the children to practice the 3 components of present moment awareness: notice it, say something about it, and experience it in a non-judgmental game-like context. So the idea here is to use all 5 of their senses to spend all of their mental energy paying very close attention to something that's there in front of them or happening in the present moment. And if we get distracted during these games, the idea is not to worry, emphasizing that that happens to everyone and spending some energy refocusing. The idea, of course, behind present moment awareness is that we spend a lot of our life on autopilot, a lot of our life not paying attention to what's going on in the present. And for people with anxiety, depression, OCD, that leaves a lot of empty mental space to spend on worrying, ruminating, thinking about things that are happening in the future that we can't predict or things that happened in the past that we can't change. So in order to solve the problems in our present, we want to refocus on the present moment. Here we have just a couple of scripts. I'm not necessarily going to read them, but the first one is just like a grounding technique using all 5 senses to observe what's around you, one you could do in really any context. And then the bottom one is our candy exercise, which is basically mindful eating and pretending you're an alien from Mars, never having eaten the candy or snack that's in front of you right now, and really using all your 5 senses to engage with that item. I would say kids really enjoy this. Obviously, it's a candy exercise, so it's definitely a highlight, but I think doing more active present moment awareness techniques in general is helpful for kids because they are kind of higher level concepts. And I think without applying them in a really concrete, clear way, it can get pretty high level for some of our younger ones. Goal 2 of module 6 is to introduce non-judgmental awareness. So we explain that non-judgmental awareness is a compassionate, kind, and accepting form of present moment awareness, sort of the traditional mindfulness we might think of, regarding what's going on inside of us and around us, accepting our own emotion states, also accepting our environmental, components. So we can also think of, non-judgmental awareness as an opposite action to worry or other efforts to suppress, control, or distract from uncomfortable thoughts the adolescent or child may be having. We emphasize non-judgmental awareness, by the way, a lot more in the adolescents than the younger children because it is a bit of a higher level concept, but sometimes I'll use kind of a brief media excerpt or video to introduce this to children as well. We don't want the adolescent to evaluate their experience as right, wrong, good, or bad. We just want them to observe their thoughts, watch their thoughts come and go, let their thoughts go, not focusing on just one specific thought because that thought elicits more anxiety. So with OCD, like, right, a thought is a thought. I let my neutral thoughts go. I let my negative thoughts go. I let my positive, like what I might consider positive thoughts go. I let them all come and I let them all go. I don't push any away more strongly. I don't hold on to any more strongly, and I don't question any or dig into any one just because it elicits a strong emotion. We want to encourage the adolescent not to evaluate their experience as right, wrong, good, or bad, and instead we want them to approach their emotional experience with empathy and understanding, sort of treating ourselves as we might treat a friend. Okay. Awareness of thoughts script is just an example of one of the non-judgmental awareness exercises that we often use. A lot of you have probably heard of it, like leaves on a stream, thoughts on a stream. That's the analogy. You can also use clouds in a sky. We have like a little video that we like to use on the sushi train analogy. I usually look on YouTube because I hate my relaxed script voice. So I usually find some short, kind of cartoony or otherwise just short and concise examples of the leaves on a stream technique, the sushi train technique, sometimes clouds in the sky technique, and anchoring in the present, to help kind of give them these concepts to take with them. And then it also is helpful because you can actually give them the links to those videos to practice during the week. So our goal too is to practice non-judgmental awareness. So we can start by doing this in a non-judgmental context by bringing in a few everyday objects and having the adolescent notice and talk about these objects. You can role play, so you could pretend you're the friend who's experiencing an emotional situation, maybe one similar to one that the adolescent might have experienced, and allow the adolescent to assist you with the non-judgmental awareness and offer you, empathic statements about your feelings. And then, like I mentioned, scripts like imagining you're sitting next to a quiet river, watching the water flow downstream, noticing how the water quietly continues to flow. It doesn't stop or get stuck. It gently keeps moving downstream, and encouraging them to take a few moments to watch the water as it flows, then encouraging them to begin to notice their thoughts. I might even extend that to notice your thoughts, physical sensations, urges to engage in emotional behaviors. What are you currently thinking and feeling? Gently place each thought onto the river and watch as your thought flows away with the water. Do not interfere with or interrupt the thought. Simply watch as your thought moves away with the water. Now, these kinds of techniques, non-judgmental and mindfulness techniques, can be helpful just to relax the mind and body, and let go of things before bed or in the morning. A lot of times I'll assign that practice on a daily basis, mostly because, well, partially just to help them out overall stress levels, but also because, it's very hard to apply these concepts in an emotional situation. So it's always better if they can have these like really automatic as skills in their back pocket from practicing in non-emotional situations, so that then when they're in a more emotional situation, it's much easier to access. So generalized emotion exposures actually we removed from the UPC. So they are just in the UPA because it's a little bit of a more complex idea. So what generalized emotion exposures are is they're activities. They might be music, they might be video clips or other media. They might be little narratives that people write, in which the adolescents are provided with that kind of stimuli, any of those stimuli that are meant to elicit some but not extreme emotional responses, and then challenge to practice present moment and non-judgmental awareness strategies in the moment of that low level emotion. For example, you might show an adolescent an emotional video clip, challenge them to remember and write down an emotion story, or have them listen to a song that elicits strong emotions. These may be important as they can help adolescents to practice awareness skills in the context of stronger emotions. When I do this, I'll typically use like kind of a more we don't like to use positive or negative, but a more pleasant emotion clip, a more distressing emotion clip, like Mufasa dying in The Lion King, with parent permission, a silly SNL skit, or something funny, something silly, so that they can kind of observe those emotional reactions. And what we'll often find is kids actually, not only do they feel like they want to avoid, thinking about and sitting with the negative emotion state, some of them actually don't want to sit with the positive emotion state, especially when it involves something silly or what seems like dumb in front of someone else. So I actually sometimes find that by playing like kind of immature video clips and stuff, it can actually cause an uncomfortable or embarrassed, reaction as well. Narratives are another example. Questions about awareness before we get into module 7, which is our big exposure module? Okay, so I know some of you at least have done exposure before. So none of this is going to be groundbreakingly different than other exposure that you've done. The difference here is that there is a transdiagnostic focus. So this is not a protocol designed to, just do exposure in the context of OCD, anxiety, irritability, sadness. It's kind of all of the above, which is nice when you have kids with comorbidities. So we've finally gotten to exposure. I want to note that before going into this the content of this module, that even though this is module 7, I know Nisa mentioned this already, but it doesn't mean that exposure has to come last or that you have to check every other skill off from the list before getting to exposure. We talked about interoceptive exposures as they're applied to sensational experiences. Even beyond interoceptive exposures, they may be other forms of exposure and opposite action that you've introduced earlier, depending on the client's presenting problems. Certainly, if you're using the UP with a client with OCD, for example, you will want to start exposure very early on in treatment. And even for kids with other presenting problems, there may be reasons why you may want to start exposure early in treatment, or just natural opportunities that come up. For example, transitions, which come up every day in session, and end up being an exposure in themselves for the child. So we want to be thinking throughout treatment about when and how exposure principles may be relevant to a particular case. And so a lot of the language that I'm using is focused more on the learning that we do during exposure, but we can also think of exposure in terms of habituation. Habituation is a gradual decrease in fear or other strong emotional states in the presence of the trigger without engaging in any avoidance or maladaptive coping behaviors. So if you look at these graphs, time is on the x-axis and our emotion is on the y-axis. On the top graph, this is what happens if we escape a situation that makes us uncomfortable. When we escape, our strong emotion goes down instantly because we're no longer in contact with the trigger. In this case, the example is a dog. But the next time the trigger comes up, the emotion will pop right back up where it was before. And we can compare this to the graph on the bottom, which is what our strong emotion looks like when we stick it out and don't escape the situation. So what you see here is that our emotion naturally declines on its own, even if we don't do anything to change the emotion. And we can use this as rationale to explain to the child or adolescent the pros and cons of facing our fears versus avoiding. Maybe when we avoid, we are getting that immediate relief, but we know that it's going to pop right back up the next time and we're going to be in the same exact spot as we were before. Whereas if we face the emotion, it'll be harder at first, but will get easier over time. And this is another example of a habituation curve, but this one depicts what happens over repeated trials of exposure. So not only do we see that habituation within one exposure trial occurs, so anxiety is going down naturally on its own during session, but we also see between session habituation, or the same exposure that used to be hard now starts to get easier than it was the last time. So really using this as a helpful visual to explain to the child a concept that they probably are already familiar with, which is that when we practice something, we get better at it and it gets easier over time. I like to use the term tolerate as well, because not all emotion states habituate as well as others. Irritability doesn't habituate as well as anxiety. Disgust certainly does not habituate as well as anxiety, and a not just right feeling does not habituate as well as anxiety. However, you can build your muscles, right? You're going to the gym, you're gradually building up your ability to tolerate these situations, and cognitively, your mind is also learning an important lesson, which is that I can handle it. And so what does the research show about exposure effectiveness? Research consistently finds that exposure is a critical treatment component and that a significant amount of change in symptoms comes after exposure is introduced in CBT. And like I mentioned earlier, beginning exposure early in treatment isn't a bad thing. It doesn't ruin rapport. It doesn't harm the client's ability to do exposure. It actually can help lead to faster improvement in symptoms. And again, we know that a lot of clinicians have very reasonable concerns about exposure and fears of causing distress in their clients, which makes sense. But really what the research does show is that exposure is associated with very few side effects, and that actually clients often receive exposure better than the therapists expect they will. Okay. So shifting gears a little bit to focus on how exposure is used within the UP, Module 7 is our situational and emotional exposure module, and it consists of 2 main goals. Okay. First goal, oop, thought it was going to turn green. The first goal is we want to review the skills that the adolescent has learned up to this point. We want to develop a hierarchy or a step ladder or both for situational emotion exposures. And then we want to use that hierarchy to engage in the situational emotion exposures that we have identified. And optionally, we can also tailor exposures to other presenting problems. For example, for youth who have a social skills deficit, we may add social skills practice within exposure. And for youth with OCD, we could do exposure and pair that with response prevention. Okay. So in terms of reviewing the skills, we can begin with an open-ended discussion, allowing the adolescent to describe the skills that they've learned already and to identify kind of which ones they have learned, one, and also found most helpful. And as a way of introducing the rationale for exposure and explaining the skills that we may want to use most before, during, and after exposures. So we've learned that emotions are normal, natural, and harmless. We've learned that a lot of strategies we typically use, like avoidance, withdrawal, aggression, don't help us feel better in the long run. They actually make us feel worse. If we've already done module 4 with our client, then we've learned that feelings we have in our body can be really uncomfortable, but aren't necessarily dangerous and usually pass on their own. If we've done module 5 with our client, we've learned that a lot of our thoughts might not be an accurate or helpful prediction of what's really going to happen because we can't see into the future. And if we've done module 6 with our client, we've learned skills for tolerating distressing thoughts and feelings using non-judgmental awareness and mindfulness skills. And so now we are going to put all of this together and put all of it to use by facing the things that we've been avoiding and testing the beliefs that we have about what might happen or the beliefs that we have about our own ability to tolerate distress. And the final goal of session 9, or this first exposure introduction session, is to finalize the children's emotional behavior forms or exposure practice, children or adolescents, really. And so we can explain that the purpose of the form is to help with planning other science experiments in which children will be facing stronger and stronger emotions. We make a list of situations that elicit any strong emotions. Does not all have to be the same emotion. For the child, keeping a record of the things we've worked on in order to see our progress over time. And there may be some ideas for situations that the caregiver comes up with that we have the child write down, and then the child can provide their own emotion ratings of how difficult they think that situation would be, and then come up with some of their own. We can kind of each provide, some of the collaboration here. And just like when we identified top problems and SMART goals, we want to make sure that the items we outline on the emotional behavior form are concrete and attainable in treatment. We want to make sure that we have items that range in their difficulty so that we have a clear place to start and then ways to increase the difficulty once the smaller items become too easy. So we have this form in the UPA workbook, this little step ladder, and a very similar form in the UPC that can serve as the jumping off point for building a hierarchy. So at the top, we can identify sort of an overarching goal that might map onto one of the SMART goals we identified at the beginning of treatment, or maybe goals have shifted slightly, which is fine. So maybe our goal is engaging in social situations, for example, to help with our social anxiety. And then we could list on this ladder different ways we could practice engaging in social situations. So maybe talking to one friend is a relatively lower rung on the ladder because that's an easier step, whereas talking in front of the class is higher up on the ladder. We could outline a hierarchy like that when we have a bunch of different exposures on each step of the ladder, and we could also outline mini hierarchies for each of those steps. So for talking to one friend, maybe the easiest first step is saying hi. Then maybe the next step is asking them a question and then talking about ourselves, and then maybe the hardest step is saying something embarrassing in front of our friend and seeing how they respond. So this form can be a jumping off point, really. But you could see how there can easily be so many different variations of one exposure. And the more information we collect ahead of time about what variations there are and what things might make it easier or harder, the better roadmap we're going to have for our exposures. And just because we list them from easiest to hardest doesn't mean we necessarily have to go in that order. We can sometimes jump around and try new things and kind of see how they do. We can also use it as a reference. Generally, we want to start with an exposure that's a bit lower on the list so that it feels like, but not something that's like lower on the list that doesn't feel overwhelming, but not something that feels silly because it's so easy. We want it to be something that we can reasonably assume will be a success, but we don't want it to be too easy because then the child doesn't feel any sense of accomplishment when they do it. Once we complete an exposure, sometimes it can be helpful to compare the difficulty to what the child estimated it would be and kind of recalibrate our list based on that as well. And similarly for UPC, we use sessions 11 to 14 for exposure completion in session and planning home exposures with the child and the caregiver. And there are a range of kinds of exposures we choose from depending on what might be most relevant to the particular client. Imaginal exposures can be useful when we aren't able to engage with the stimuli in person. So for example, imagine you're flying on an airplane, since that's not something we can always do spontaneously. Although in vivo exposures are ideal if they're an option. Narrative exposures are most often used for kids who have experienced trauma as a way of processing the traumatic event, or kids who are big worriers about things that aren't so realistic. Interoceptive exposures, like we talked about, are great for panic. And then response prevention is a form of exposure that's particularly relevant for clients with OCD. That includes preventing the use of compulsions during and after the exposure. So just some final suggestions. We want to check in and ask youth to report how they feel. In order to kind of keep them in the moment, reduce distraction, reduce avoidance of the exposure at hand. We want to emphasize whether, if expectations or beliefs were violated, we want to emphasize that so that they kind of, that sinks in for them. We want to break away from the hierarchy. We want to vary the intensity of exposure so that they're a little less predictable and more realistic. We want to use exposure in multiple contexts so that they could generalize. We want to combine exposures. We can combine an interoceptive exposure with, vomit pictures for like a more realistic, uncomfortable vomit situation. Eat a big snack and then do jumping jacks and look at pictures of vomit, right? We want to combine exposure, like I said, practice seeking out negative outcomes too. Like we don't want every social exposure to end with like, yeah, great job, right? We want sometimes to have more neutral, reactions as well. And we should definitely make exposures fun. There's a lot of strategies that we can use to make exposures fun for kids, including adding games, reappraising the exposure by using our skills that we've already learned, using technology, using rewards for exposure completion. We can make them more fun for kids. So that basically to build motivation, to make engagement higher, to make the exposure more memorable, and to make it more likely that the child is going to be willing to sustain exposure engagement during treatment and between sessions. Module 8 is pretty simple. It's basically just our typical relapse prevention module. Goal 1 is to review skills that have been most successful. Goal 2 is to review progress and discuss changes in top problems ratings. And goal 3 is to make a post-treatment plan in order to prevent relapse and in order to kind of encourage clients to continue to identify things that are challenging, to challenge themselves in important ways, and to use their skills going forward and become their own therapists. Here's our diploma. Questions? I'm going to stop sharing.
I'll take that as we were so clear in our explanation that no one has a single question.
Are there any
I have one. I'm
Okay,
sorry.
go ahead.
It was really clear. Thank you. Really helpful. I wanted to ask you again about the book you said, so I could read more about it.
Yeah, so the books are available on Amazon. And then on Oxford University Press, all of the worksheets are in fillable PDF for free. So you could just download them from Oxford University Press.
Thank you very much.
I was going to ask if there were any exclusionary criteria for the children. Would
That's
you
a good question. One thing that comes to mind is like cognitive capacity. So if there are kids who, would have trouble digesting the concepts, that's definitely something that can be difficult. We do work with a lot of people on the spectrum, with comorbid autism, comorbid ADHD, other learning difficulties. It's just a matter of, meeting them where they're at in terms of the content. And, we might present things in slightly different ways, but actually the visual presentation in the UPC works super well for kids on the spectrum because a lot of times they enjoy the structure, of the worksheets, and pairing it with a visual schedule and a reward system can work really well with kids who have difficulty maintaining attention as well.
But what
I'd
about
say-
like self-injurious behavior? Sorry, like hitting or
Yeah, I mean, I would say that we manage non-suicidal self-injury as long as it's not extremely intense within our training clinic. We often, if DBT, for example, would be a better fit, we refer out to DBT, but we don't. Sometimes it's hard to get DBT for some of these families, and in KMAT in particular, we offer treatment at no cost due to because of a grant, and so sometimes we'll incorporate other emotion regulation strategies at the front end to manage the self-injury that is like kind of a theoretical to our protocol, right? So we might include some kind of relaxation strategies or those things if a client cannot sit with the emotion just yet. But the other exclusionary would be if it's primary, disruptive behavior, in which case a different treatment protocol would be better.
I wanted to allow someone else to ask a question. I had another one about efficacy data. So for the outcome measures, we're looking for a decrease in neuroticism, or, what are the indicators of successful treatment? What measures do you repeat?
Yeah, so we usually use the top problems assessment throughout. That's really what's written in the protocol, is like the main progress monitoring tool is generally learning how to decreases in top problems. But if you are wanting outcome monitoring using the RCADS pre, mid, and post is something we do, and that one I think is free. Strength and difficulties questionnaire is another one that's free. The neuroticisms that we use more in research than we do kind of in our regular practice.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I was just pasting all the links into the
Yeah,
chat.
thanks, Jamie.
So the
Yes.
first two are the worksheet, the fillable worksheets, and then the rest are the Amazon books. Oh yeah, and trauma. So if trauma is primary and it's
Yeah.
really primary, so like if like
Mhm.
really you're seeing like almost no emotional disorder symptoms turning into really clearly linked to the trauma or grief, a lot of times we will be more likely to encourage use of like a trauma or grief specific protocol.
Mhm.
Anything else?
Anyone?
Well, thank you all so much. I appreciate you being here and allowing us to chat with you. Obviously, like Jamie and I mentioned, this was really just an overview. I mean, just so quick. So like if there are pending questions, that makes sense. And if anyone has any further interest in training, don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you guys. Thanks so much for doing this. It's really outstanding. I loved it. Thank you.